Hey guys, welcome back to Dark Ascent, and today I'll show you what the highest mountain on Earth did to a rich, arrogant couple who spent the entire expedition treating the Sherpas, keeping them alive like trash. They had paid for one of the best guides on Everest, and high in the death zone they mocked and laughed off. That gives you any real chance of getting down alive, and what those Sherpas had to do next will leave you absolutely speechless. It was the 20th of May, 2012. And for the first time in weeks, the summit of Everest was something close to climbable. For days, the jet stream had been dragging itself across the top with gusts strong enough to throw a grown person clean off the ridge. And now, for a narrow handful of days, it edged north, dropping the winds up high to a level the guides were finally willing to gamble on, opening the short weather window that every team on the mountain had been waiting the whole season for. Down at base camp, spread across the groaning rubble of the Khumbu Glacier, at around 17,600 feet, hundreds of climbers checked their headlamps and radios and crampons and summit packs in the freezing dark because a window like this does not come twice. And among them were a couple from Southern California, Vince and Nina Calhoun, 38 and 36, who had spent a small fortune and a great deal of other people's patience to stand on top of the world. They were, by nearly every account of that season, a guide team's worst nightmare. Back home, they were wealthy in the loud, self-assured way, a real estate fortune on his side and an old family one on hers. And they had built their whole shared life around a single belief that excuses were for the weak and that anyone who wanted a thing badly enough could simply grind their way to it. Somewhere along the line, they had started collecting mountains the way other people collect fine wine. Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, Denali, each one a story for a dinner party. Everest was meant to be the crown on all of it. They had met a decade earlier and had spent the years since convincing each other that their certainty was the same thing as ability. What Everest was never meant to be in their minds was difficult in any way they could not simply outwork or outspend. Getting to Everest at all means the better part of a week on foot up the Khumbu Valley, through the Sherpa homeland, past stone villages and spinning prayer wheels and monasteries older than any nation the couple had ever climbed in. Most visitors arrived quietly humbled by it. Vince and Nina arrived impatient with all of it, treating the villages as an inconvenient delay between them and the summit, loudly comparing the tea houses to the resorts they were used to. The problem is that Everest does not reward that. It rewards judgment and patience, and above all, it rewards listening, which were the three things the couple had spent a lifetime refusing to do. From almost the first day, the people they treated worst were the very people their lives would soon depend on. On any Everest expedition, the Sherpa team is the entire reason anyone gets up the mountain and back down alive. Before most commercial climbers move above base camp, a small and almost unbelievably brave crew, known as the Icefall Doctors, goes into the Khumbu Icefall, a slow-motion avalanche of shifting ice towers and bottomless crevasses, and stitches a route through it with aluminum ladders lashed end to end and miles of rope. The glacier destroys their work constantly, and they go back in and rebuild it again and again because it is the only way onto the mountain. It is the most dangerous stretch of the whole climb. The icefall has killed working Sherpas in numbers that would shut down any ordinary job on Earth, most of them caught in the cold hours before dawn, while their clients were still asleep in their tents. The crossings themselves are their own nightmare. 3 and 4 ladders lashed together over a crevasse so deep the bottom is only darkness, flexing underfoot while crampon points skate on the bare rungs. Above the icefall, the climbing Sherpas carry the tents and stoves and food and hundreds of oxygen cylinders up to the high camps, load after load after load, each one heavy enough to buckle the knees. A seasonal rope-fixing team, paid for jointly by the commercial operators, sets the fixed line all the way to the summit, while the rest dig the platforms, melt the snow, brew the tea, and when a client falls apart high on the mountain, as happens every season, it is almost always a Sherpa who turns around and drags them back down. Most of them do it for a season's wage that would not cover a single week of what their clients spend to be there. Whenever I see a summit photo, I think about who really earned it, because the client did almost none of it. Every ladder, every fixed rope, every stocked camp was set there first by someone else. Vince and Nina seemed to see none of it. At base camp, they were merely curt and demanding, the kind of clients who summoned a Sherpa across camp with a snap of the fingers, and sent a plate of food back to a cook who had carried that stove up a mountain on his own spine. But as the weeks wore on and the thin air and the endless waiting frayed them, it curdled into something worse. they took to mocking the Sherpas, using accented English to their faces and imitating it under their breath, and complaining loudly that the constant load carrying was holding the whole schedule back. The other clients on the team, a quiet mix of doctors and engineers who had trained for years and saved for longer, began eating at odd hours just to avoid sitting near them. By the second rotation, the expedition leader had already taken the two of them aside once about their conduct, and a couple of the younger Sherpas had asked not to be paired with them, but they were paying clients on a short season. The operator did not want the fight, and so it slid, the way these things do until the mountain settles the question itself. The Sherpas said little. They had seen clients like this before, and they met every insult with the same even courtesy, pouring the tea, shouldering the loads, quietly marking which of their charges would need the most, looking after when things got hard. And then came the puja. Before anyone will climb above base camp and into the Khumbu icefall, nearly the whole expedition gathers at a stone altar for a blessing ceremony led by a lama. An hours-long ritual of chanting and burning juniper and rice, and offerings laid carefully in the snow meant to ask the mountain itself for safe passage. To the Sherpas it is not a formality, but the single most important morning of the climb. The couple treated it as a tedious delay. They talked through it in normal voices, checked their watches, laughed under their breath at the chanting, and at one point, Vince said, just loud enough to carry, that he hoped the mountain took credit cards. One of the older Sherpas finally turned and asked them, quietly, to show a little respect. I have seen Sherpas refuse to climb a single step until that ceremony is finished, because to them, the mountain has to bless the attempt first. Mocking it is not rudeness to them, it is danger. The head of their Sherpa team was a Sirdar named Mingma, a man in his 40s who had stood on that summit more times than the couple had climbed anything at all in their lives. Mingma was known up and down the Khumbu Valley for two things: an almost unshakable calm and a flat refusal to gamble with a client's life for the sake of a summit. He had grown up in a village 3 days foot travel from the nearest road, had lost friends on this mountain, and guided anyway, because it fed his family and because he was extraordinarily good at it. He had turned clients around a stone's throw from the top before, lost the tips and the glowing reviews for it, and slept perfectly well afterward, because every one of those clients had gone home breathing. The younger Sherpas trusted him completely, because a Sirdar who will swallow an angry client and a lost bonus rather than risk a life is the only kind worth following into the death zone. One evening at Camp 2, Mingma pulled Vince aside and told him plainly that he was not resting or drinking enough, that the mountain did not care about his money or his opinion of himself. Vince clapped him on the shoulder, called him a good little guide, and turned to Nina to joke that even the locals could tell who the real athletes were. Mingma did not rise to it. He simply went back to the quiet, grinding work of trying to keep two people alive who seemed determined to make it impossible. An Everest climb is not one long push, but a series of acclimatization rotations, climbing high and then sleeping low over and over, so the body can slowly build the extra red blood cells and the other slow adaptations it needs to survive on a fraction of the oxygen it is used to. It is slow, it is boring, it is deeply uncomfortable, and it cannot be rushed, because the alternative is a lung or a brain that quietly fills with fluid. Mingma built the couple a careful, conservative schedule of these rotations, up to Camp 1 at nearly 20,000 feet, then Camp 2 at just over 21,000, then a punishing touch of Camp 3 on the sheer blue ice of the Lhotse face at around 23,500 feet. The Lhotse face is a wall of glassy ice, steep enough that a careless slip means a slide of thousands of feet, and it has claimed many climbers over the years. They ignored most of it. They resisted rest days, pushed too hard on the rotation climbs, and treated every slow day as wasted time, not understanding that on this mountain, a fast ascent is not a trophy, but a warning sign of a body that has not adjusted. Midway through the rotations, a climber on a neighboring team came down with the wet, drowning cough of high-altitude pulmonary edema, his lungs slowly filling from the inside, and two Sherpas half-carried him down through the icefall in the dark to save his life. The couple watched the rescue begin from outside their tent and remarked, loud enough to be heard, that some people simply were not built for greatness. Let me tell you what this place does to the impatient. A body needs weeks to build the blood cells for that altitude, and no amount of fitness or willpower buys you out of the wait. One of their own teammates, a surgeon who had trained 3 years for the climb, later described the couple at Camp 2 laughing that Everest was the easiest of their mountains, Because on this, one other people carried everything that truly mattered. By the third week of May, the couple had done just barely enough that the expedition leader judged them ready to join the summit push. Mingma argued against it. He could see that neither of them had truly acclimatized, that they were burning energy they had never banked, that they treated his every warning as the nagging of an employee. But the expedition operator had a business to protect and 2 clients who simply would not hear the word no. And under steady pressure from both, Mingma agreed to lead them. He agreed on one condition, the same condition he had set for every client he had ever guided. They would turn around at 11 in the morning on summit day. Summit or no summit, standing on the very top or a single step below it, at 11, they would go down. It is one of the oldest rules that modern high-altitude guides insist upon, and it has saved more lives on Everest than any single piece of equipment ever invented. Vince and Nina nodded along, in the easy way people nod at a rule they have already privately decided will not apply to them, and it is worth understanding why neither of them would ever have turned back on their own. Their whole life ran on refusing to, on being the 2 who kept going when everyone else quit. Turning around at 11 would not have felt like safety. It would have felt like betraying the one thing they had ever truly believed about themselves. The night before the summit push, Nina sent a short satellite message to a friend back home. It said the guides kept muttering about turning around, and that turning around was the one thing the 2 of them had never in their lives been any good at. The final camp, the South Col, is a wind-flattened saddle of ice and spent oxygen bottles at around 26,000 feet, sitting right on the ragged edge of what climbers simply call, above that line the human body is quite literally dying, unable to rest or heal or digest, the brain starved and slow, everything running down a clock that cannot be stopped and can only be outrun. Bottled oxygen buys a little time against that clock, but not much. Each cylinder lasts only a handful of hours, and a summit day can burn several of them per climber, which is why the Sherpas go up carrying several spares, more than 30 pounds between them. The hardest thing I ever have to explain is the turnaround time, because it means quitting with the summit right there. Most who die up high were not too weak to climb, they climbed too late. The couple left camp close to 10 at night, a little behind their Sherpas, headlamps threading up into the black. From the first hours they were slow. They stopped constantly to rest and photograph themselves. They fell behind in the long, single file of climbers, all clipped to one fixed rope, then wasted precious strength trying to shove past slower people along a knife of a ridge with a mile of darkness falling away on either side. When they reached the balcony at first light, just above 27,000 feet, they were already badly behind schedule, and ahead of them, a bottleneck was forming where the ridge steepened. Dozens of climbers stacked nose to tail on a single rope. At that height, a traffic jam is not an inconvenience, but a slow death sentence. Every motionless hour draining bottles that had been counted to the last breath before anyone left camp. Higher up, past the exposed traverse and the airy step of rock and snow near the top, the crowd thinned as the sensible climbers, the ones who had done their arithmetic, began turning for home. The temperature up there sat far below 0 even before the wind, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in a minute or 2, and the couple were losing precious heat every time they stopped to pose for another photograph. One of them, masked and hunched against the wind, stopped beside Mingma to tell him it was getting late and ugly up top, the kind of warning mountaineers give only when they mean it. Mingma did his own arithmetic and did not like the answer. He got on the radio to base camp and said what he was seeing, that his clients were badly behind schedule and slowing, not speeding up. The team doctor far below said the only thing there was to say, that the couple were already beyond the turnaround and needed to start down at once. 11 in the morning came and went with the summit still a long, rising ridge away. Mingma stopped the couple just below the south summit at around 28,700 feet and told them as plainly as his English would allow that it was finished, that they had to turn around now, that people who summit this late simply do not make it home. What happened next played out in front of the Sherpas and a handful of climbers still within earshot, and it is the part that still makes the ones who were there fall silent. Vince laughed at him. Nina told him, through her oxygen mask, that they had not spent $100,000 to be turned around this close to the top by their own porter, and then the 2 of them pushed past him, clipping their safety tethers on up the fixed rope, and kept climbing, leaving the one man trying to save their lives just a step behind. The Sherpas who were there say Mingma did not argue after that. He simply turned and climbed after them, one step behind, because leaving 2 clients alone up there would have been the same as killing them with his own hands, and because looking after people who plainly despised him was, in the end, still the work he had come to do. This is the moment I got extremely frustrated at. 2 people got told by one of the most experienced Sherpas, keeping them alive, that they would die if they continued, and they still attempted the summit. They reached the summit shortly after 1 in the afternoon, more than 2 hours past the cutoff. By then, most of the morning crowds were already well into their descent, and the top of the world was nearly empty. There are 2 photographs of it, taken by Mingma because they insisted on them even then. Nina weeping behind her mask, Vince with both fists in the air, the curve of the entire earth falling away behind them into haze. For a few minutes up there they were exactly the people they had always believed themselves to be, unstoppable and exceptional and right. It was the last time either of them would ever feel that way. They had what they came for, and they had almost nothing left to spend getting back down. The descent is where Everest kills most of the people it kills, and the couple began theirs already wrecked, dangerously low on oxygen, and hours too late in the day. Far below them, the afternoon cloud was boiling up out of the valleys, swallowing the lower camps one by one, and the wind that Mingma had feared for 2 days was beginning to return, this time for good. Most people picture the summit as the finish line, but on Everest it is barely halftime, and the tired, thin-aired stumble back down is when the great majority of its dead are made. Somewhere above the balcony, at just above 27,000 feet, Vince's oxygen ran dry. Mingma had already switched them onto the last spare cylinders he had, and had radioed down again and again for more bottles to be brought up, but there is a hard ceiling on what any one person can haul at that height. The extra hours the couple had spent chasing the summit were now hours of oxygen that simply did not exist, and the storm was sealing the mountain shut behind them. Vince had been slowing and slurring for a while by then, worn down by the hours of effort and the thin air and the cold, and once his oxygen ran out, the slow decline became a collapse. He tripped over his own crampons and lost the thread of simple instructions, the unmistakable signs of the brain swelling that mountaineers call cerebral edema. The only real cure is to lose altitude fast, but Vince could no longer make his legs obey him, and a grown man who cannot help carry himself is very nearly impossible to move on that terrain. Before long, he could not stand at all. Nina, barely conscious herself, sat down in the snow beside him and would not be moved. She refused Mingma over and over, insisting they were not leaving without each other, the same fierce loyalty that had built their whole life together, now nailing them both to the mountain. And the storm came down over all 3 of them like a lid, and not long after, the last of the daylight went with it. The radio traffic from that evening, later pieced back together from the expedition's surviving radio records, is hard to sit with. Mingma calling down that the man was gone in the head and could not be moved, that the woman refused to leave him, that his own oxygen was finished, and his strength was going, and base camp answering with the one thing he already knew, that nothing and no one could reach him in the dark at that height. People always ask me why a helicopter cannot just come. Up that high, in the dark and the storm, no machine can fly a rescue load to you, so your only hope is whoever is already up there. And that, in the end, is exactly who came. Down at the South Col, a young Sherpa named Pemba, barely into his 20s and on only his 2nd expedition, sat listening to the radio traffic and did the math that everyone warmer and safer was too honest to argue with. He was Mingma's nephew. Without a word of complaint, he switched onto a fresh oxygen cylinder, packed 2 spares he could scarcely afford to give away, and started back up into the storm with an older cousin named Dawa, the 2 of them climbing into the dark toward the very people they had watched laugh at Mingma a dozen times over. A 3rd Sherpa pulled his frozen boots back on and followed a little later. Not one of the couple's fellow paying clients left the warmth of their tents. Pemba had summited only once, had none of his uncle's decades of instinct, and knew exactly how thin his own margin was. He and Dawa went anyway, breaking trail through fresh snow with their heads down against a wind that flung the ice sideways and tore the words out of their mouths, following a fixed rope they could barely see into the conditions that had already stopped everyone else on the mountain cold. A viewer called Tlaina told me under the last vid that Sherpas deserve more respect than anyone else on those mountains. Tlaina, you and just about everyone else watching are about to be proven right, by what Pemba does next. When they finally reached the balcony, they found Mingma still there, half frozen, and beginning to slur himself now, having sacrificed much of the oxygen he had saved for his own descent and flatly refusing to leave two clients who could no longer stand. They found Vince already gone, sitting upright in the snow where the cold had quietly taken him, and they found Nina alive, but only just, drifting in and out, her hands and face already showing deep frostbite. There was no version of this that ended well. The rescuers were out of daylight and nearly out of oxygen, with one dead client and one dying one. On the most unforgiving ground on the planet, anyone with sense would have stayed in the tents. For hours in the screaming dark, they tried everything they had anyway. They wrapped her, forced their own oxygen onto her, and tried to guide and support and lower a limp adult down terrain where a strong, healthy climber needs both hands and total concentration just to keep himself alive. A person that far gone becomes a dead weight of limbs and frozen gear, and there is no machine, no clever trick, no reserve of strength at that altitude that makes the job possible. There is only the trying and the cost of it. Say Pemba's name with me for a second. The rescue saved no one. It only wrecked the men who tried, and he lost most of his fingers for the woman who called his uncle a servant. Nina died a little before dawn, only a few hundred feet below the balcony, during the long effort to lower her, without ever truly waking up. Vince and Nina Calhoun are still on Everest, above 26,000 feet. Carrying a body down is a task that routinely costs the living their own lives, and so, like more than 200 people before them, the couple was left somewhere along the route they had refused to leave, passed quietly each season by the climbers who come after. It is a strange, awful kind of permanence that two people who wanted the entire world to watch them reach the top should end up staying near it forever, in a place almost no one who ever loved them will see. Mingma survived and stepped away from the high mountain for good the following year. Pemba survived too, without his fingers, and without much patience for anyone who wants him to relive the night he climbed into a storm for two people who never once bothered to learn his name. People familiar with the expedition later said the operator quietly tightened its own turnaround policy after that season, a small and bitter kind of progress bought at a price nobody had ever wanted to pay. No one outside the Sherpa team saw every second of what happened after Vince and Nina pushed past the turnaround point. What was later understood came from Mingma, Pemba, Dawa, the third Sherpa who followed into the storm, the climbers who saw the couple near the south summit and the balcony, the surviving radio records from base camp, and the oxygen and summit timelines reconstructed after the expedition. They agreed to tell it not to shame the dead, but so that the next loud, certain, unstoppable client might hear the word "no" just a little differently. The story moved through the climbing world, the way these stories always do, quietly, from tent to tea house to the long flights home, until much of the climbing community that season knew some version of it. In most of those versions, the couple are not even the main characters. The names people remember are the ones the two of them never bothered to learn, Mingma and Pemba, and the men who went up into the dark after them. So when you stand below something that can kill you, listen to the ones who know it best, the workers you would rather ignore. I promise, the mountain is never impressed by anyone who will not turn around.